A retired firefighter saves a dog trapped in a frozen lake. But the family's response the next morning leaves him completely speechless. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Frank Wilson stared at the photograph on his nightstand, Margaret's smile frozen in time. The morning light filtered through half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the empty side of the bed where his wife had slept for 42 years. 3 years since cancer had taken her, yet the indentation on her pillow remained, preserved like a sacred relic. His arthritic fingers traced the silver frame as they did every morning, a ritual that anchored him to the waking world. At 68, the retired firefighter found each day identical to the last, a monotonous blur of solitude, punctuated only by the persistent ache in his shoulder, a souvenir from the Riverside Hotel fire that had hastened his retirement. "Another day, Maggie," he whispered to the empty room. Frank shuffled to the kitchen, his slippers scraping against the hardwood floor. The coffee ritual was mechanical. Filter, 2 scoops of grounds, 6 cups of water. He'd been making coffee for 195 days, but still prepared enough for 2, a habit he couldn't bring himself to break. While it brewed, he swallowed his daily medications: blood pressure, cholesterol, anti-inflammatory for the arthritic shoulder. The morning paper lay untouched as he sipped his coffee black, staring out the window at the snow-covered park across the street. It had been Margaret's idea to buy this apartment with its view of Lakeview Park, "So we can watch the seasons change when we're too old to walk through them," she'd said. Now he walked through those seasons alone, following the same path every morning regardless of weather. Frank dressed methodically. Thermal underwear, it was 17 degrees outside, flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, thick socks. His wedding band caught the light as he pulled on his boots. Despite everything, he'd never considered removing it. The elevator was empty as usual at 7:30 a.m. Mrs. Abernathy from 3B was likely still asleep, Mr. Gunderson from 4A already at work. Frank had memorized his neighbors' schedules without ever engaging in more than cursory nods in the hallway. The fewer connections, the fewer losses to mourn. Outside, his breath formed clouds in the frigid January air. The park was a winter wonderland, pristine snow covering the walking paths despite the city's half-hearted attempts to clear them. It was Saturday, and families had already begun to arrive. Parents building snowmen with children, teenagers having snowball fights, couples walking hand in hand, their gloved fingers intertwined. Frank kept to the perimeter, watching life unfold at a safe distance. He'd been a rescuer his entire career, rushing into burning buildings, pulling people from car wrecks, reviving drowning victims. Now he was merely an observer, unwilling to participate in the very life he'd once saved for others. His usual bench near the small lake remained unoccupied, as it typically was in winter. Frank brushed off the snow and sat down, feeling the cold seep through his beige overcoat. The lake had frozen solid during the December cold snap, though warning signs posted around its perimeter cautioned against venturing onto the ice. Ducks huddled near a small, unfrozen section at the center, where an underground spring created a perpetual weak spot. Frank watched them, envying their simple existence. Feed, swim, mate, repeat. No grief, no regrets, no memories of failing to save those who counted on you. The piercing scream broke his reverie. "Help! Somebody help us!" Frank's head snapped up, decades of training taking over before his conscious mind could intervene. About 50 yards away, a young girl stood at the lake's edge, her small body rigid with panic. She couldn't have been more than 10, her purple winter coat and matching hat dusted with snow, hands waving frantically as she continued to scream. Max, please, someone help!" Frank was on his feet, scanning the situation before he'd fully processed the girl's words. His eyes locked onto the source of her distress. A golden retriever puppy had ventured onto the ice and fallen through at the lake's center, precisely in the weak spot Frank had noticed earlier. The dog paddled desperately, whining in terror, its small head barely visible above the dark water. Frank moved toward the scene, his pace quickening despite the protest from his arthritic knee. The old instincts resurfaced: assess the situation, identify risks, formulate a plan. A middle-aged woman, presumably the girl's mother, ran toward her child from a nearby path. "Emma, get back from the edge!" the woman shouted, grabbing her daughter's shoulders. "But Max is drowning!" The girl's voice broke with sobs. "Please do something!" Frank reached them just as a young man in a puffy coat approached from the opposite direction, cell phone already pressed to his ear. "I'm calling 911, the man announced. "They'll send emergency services." Frank made a rapid assessment. The puppy was struggling to keep its head above water, its front paws scrabbling unsuccessfully at the ice edge. Its movements were already slowing, hypothermia setting in rapidly in the near-freezing water. The response time for emergency services, even in ideal conditions, would be at least 8 minutes. The puppy had perhaps 3. "The ice won't hold you," the young man warned as Frank removed his overcoat. "I know," Frank replied, not bothering to explain that he'd performed ice rescues annually during his 27 years with the fire department. "But that dog doesn't have time to wait for rescue services." Frank spread his coat on the snow and quickly evaluated the ice. January had been cold enough for a solid freeze, but the spring-fed center remained treacherous. He'd need to distribute his weight evenly and avoid the darker patches indicating thinner ice. His wedding ring caught the sunlight as he lowered himself onto his belly. Frank paused, touching the gold band briefly before beginning to inch forward on his elbows and toes, using his coat as a makeshift sled to better distribute his weight. "Mister, please be careful," the girl called, her voice quavering. The mother pulled her daughter closer. "Emma, stay back!" A small crowd began to gather as Frank slowly crawled forward. The ice groaned beneath him, a sound he remembered well from training exercises. He moved deliberately, ignoring the stabbing pain in his shoulder and the ache in his joints as the cold seeped through his clothes. 20 feet from shore, the ice thinned noticeably. Frank paused, calculating. The puppy's paddling had weakened, its whimpers growing fainter. Behind him, he heard more voices, someone suggesting a human chain, another arguing they should wait for professionals. "Hang on, little buddy," Frank muttered, resuming his careful approach. At 15 feet from the hole, a sharp crack sounded beneath him. Frank froze, redistributing his weight. Water had begun seeping through his pant legs, the cold burning against his skin like fire. He thought of the arthritis that would flare mercilessly tonight, the antibiotic ointment he'd need for the inevitable cuts from the ice. None of it mattered. The dog was fading fast. "Please save Max!" Emma's desperate plea carried across the ice. "Please!" Frank inched closer. 10 feet. 8. 6. The puppy's eyes locked with his, a silent plea that reached past Frank's carefully constructed walls. 3 feet from the edge, Frank stretched out his arm, his fingers just missing the dog's collar. "Come on," he urged, extending himself further. The ice cracked ominously. Without hesitation, Frank made his decision. He shifted his weight forward deliberately, allowing his upper body to break through into the water. The shock of the cold tore the breath from his lungs, pain lancing through his chest and shoulder, as if he'd been stabbed with icicles. His training took over. He had seconds before his muscles would begin to fail. Frank lunged forward, grabbing the puppy's collar with numbing fingers. With a powerful backward thrust, he pulled the animal onto the firmer ice while pushing with his free arm to haul his own torso out of the water. "I've got you," he gasped, tucking the trembling, soaked puppy against his body. Reversing his path was harder, his wet clothes heavy and rapidly stiffening in the frigid air. Each movement was agony, but Frank persisted, distributing his weight carefully as he worked his way back toward shore, protecting the shivering puppy with his body. When he reached solid ground, willing hands helped him to his feet. The puppy was immediately whisked away by Emma, who wrapped her pet in tearful hugs, while her mother enveloped them both in a thermal blanket she'd retrieved from her car. "That was incredibly brave," the mother said, turning to Frank. "How can we possibly thank you? Please, let me pay for your ruined clothes, or perhaps dinner." "Not necessary," Frank cut her off with a dismissive wave, ignoring how his hands trembled uncontrollably. Water dripped from his clothes, already turning to ice in the bitter cold. "Just do me a favor and teach your daughter about safety around frozen lakes." Other bystanders pressed forward with offers of blankets and rides home, but Frank backed away, uncomfortable with the attention. His chest burned with each breath, his clothes stiffening by the second. He needed to get home before hypothermia set in. "Sir, at least tell us your name," the young man with the phone called after him. Frank turned away without answering, trudging through the snow toward his apartment building. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him acutely aware of the pain in every joint. Yet beneath the discomfort, an unfamiliar sensation flickered. Purpose. For those brief moments on the ice, he'd felt alive again, necessary, the emptiness temporarily filled by someone else's need. As he let himself into his apartment, Frank stripped off his frozen clothes and stepped into a hot shower, letting the water cascade over his aching body. He closed his eyes against the steam, seeing Margaret's face, knowing she would have called him 10 kinds of fool for risking himself, before kissing him and telling him she was proud. While Frank rubbed circulation back into his bluish fingertips, he remained unaware of the teenager who had captured the entire rescue on his smartphone, already uploading the video to social media with the caption, "Badass old guy saves puppy from frozen lake." Nor could he imagine how this simple act of courage would soon shatter the isolated existence he had so carefully constructed around himself. Frank awoke to a symphony of pain. His shoulder throbbed with fiery intensity, his lower back screamed in protest, and every joint in his body seemed to have aged a decade overnight. Consequences of yesterday's plunge into the frozen lake, no doubt. He groaned, reaching for the bottle of anti-inflammatory medication on his nightstand, dry swallowing 2 pills before slowly, painfully sitting up. The clock read 9:37 a.m., unusually late for him. The hot shower last night had prevented the worst of the hypothermia, but his body was making him pay for the exertion now. Frank shuffled to the kitchen, wincing with each step, and brewed his customary pot of coffee. As he waited for the caffeine to kick in, memories of yesterday's rescue floated through his mind. The terrified puppy, the sobbing girl, the icy water that had felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into his skin. The insistent buzz of his apartment doorbell jarred him from his thoughts. Frank frowned. In 3 years, he could count on one hand the number of visitors he'd received, the building superintendent about a leak, a determined vacuum salesman, and Mrs. Abernathy from 3B when she'd locked herself out. The buzzing continued, more insistent now. Frank shuffled toward the door, wondering if the superintendent had received complaints about water damage from his dripping clothes in the hallway yesterday. "Coming," he called gruffly, unlocking the door and pulling it open. Frank blinked in surprise. Standing before him was the girl from yesterday, Emma, he recalled, flanked by a tall, serious-looking man and the woman who'd offered to replace his clothes. Between them stood the golden retriever puppy, now dry and energetic, wearing a homemade sign around its neck that read, "My Hero," in childish handwriting adorned with glitter and hearts. "Mr. Wilson!" Emma exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. "You're a celebrity!" Before Frank could respond, the girl thrust a colorful envelope into his hands, beaming up at him with unbridled admiration. "How did you find my address?" Frank asked, confusion overriding his normal tendency to avoid interaction. The man, presumably Emma's father, extended his hand. "Robert Thompson. My wife Diane and daughter Emma are extremely grateful for what you did yesterday." He gestured toward the envelope in Frank's hand. The video of the rescue has gone viral. A neighbor recognized you entering this building and directed us here." "Video?" Frank echoed, the word landing like a stone in his stomach. Diane nodded, her smile warm. "Some teenager filmed the whole thing. It's got over 100,000 views already. Emma's entire school is talking about the brave retired firefighter." Frank felt heat rising to his face. After 3 years of carefully cultivating anonymity following Margaret's death, the last thing he wanted was public attention. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure how to respond. Emma solved his dilemma by ducking under his arm and entering the apartment, her curious eyes immediately drawn to the dusty photographs on the bookshelf. "Emma," her mother called, embarrassed. "You can't just walk into someone's home." "It's fine," Frank said, though it wasn't, not really. But refusing would require more social energy than simply allowing the brief intrusion. He stepped back, reluctantly inviting the family inside. "We won't stay long," Robert assured him, guiding the excited puppy through the door. "Emma insisted on thanking you personally." The apartment felt suddenly smaller, crowded not just with people, but with an energy Frank had forgotten existed. The girl moved about the living room like a whirlwind of curiosity, studying the few personal items Frank hadn't packed away after Margaret's death. "Is this you in your uniform?" Emma asked, pointing to a framed photograph. "Wow. And is this your wife?" The innocent question hit Frank like a physical blow. He cleared his throat, walking over to where Emma stood holding a picture of him and Margaret at his retirement ceremony. "Yes, that's Margaret. She—" He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. Diane touched his arm gently. "We know she passed away. Emma researched everything about you before we came over. We hope we're not intruding on your grief." "The fire department is planning a ceremony to honor you," Emma interrupted, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents. "And my school wants you to come talk about safety." Frank felt panic rising in his chest. The thought of facing his former colleagues, many of whom he'd avoided since Margaret's funeral, was terrifying. They would have questions, expectations, desires to reconnect that he simply couldn't fulfill. "I don't think that's a good idea," he muttered, just as the telephone rang. The landline he kept mainly out of habit, as few people had the number anymore. Grateful for the interruption, Frank moved to answer it. "Excuse me." "Franco, you stubborn old mule," boomed a familiar voice. 3 years without a word, and I have to find out from a viral video that you're still throwing yourself into rescues?" Frank sank into the armchair beside the phone table. "Hello, Sam." Sam Kelly had been Frank's partner for 15 years, before becoming the fire chief. He'd been persistent after Margaret's death, calling regularly until Frank's continued rebuffs finally discouraged him. "Don't hello Sam me like we talked yesterday," Sam scolded, though Frank could hear the smile in his voice. "The whole department's buzzing about your polar plunge. The rookies need to meet the legend. And Jennifer's been asking about you." Frank winced at the mention of Jennifer. She'd been his partner in his final years before retirement and Margaret's closest friend. After the funeral, Jennifer's grief had been too raw, too similar to his own. He couldn't bear it. "Sam, I'm not up for a reunion," Frank began, only to be interrupted. "Next Thursday, lunch at the station. No arguments, Franco. 3 years is long enough to hide." As Frank tried to formulate a response, he noticed Emma had discovered the scrapbook Margaret had kept of his career highlights. The girl was leafing through yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs, her eyes wide with fascination. "What happened in this fire?" she asked, pointing to a grainy photo from the Riverside disaster. The image showed Frank being treated by paramedics, the burn on his arm clearly visible, smoke still rising from the hotel in the background. Frank crossed the room in 3 strides and closed the book firmly. "Some stories aren't for children," he said, more sharply than he'd intended. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. broken only when the phone rang again. Frank answered it mechanically. "Mr. Wilson, this is Principal Garcia from Lakeside Elementary. I'm calling to formally invite you to speak to our students about ice safety. Your heroic actions yesterday have provided a wonderful teaching opportunity." Frank listened to the principal's enthusiastic invitation, making non-committal responses while watching the Thompson family examine his sparse living room. Max the puppy had settled comfortably at Emma's feet, seemingly no worse for his near-death experience. After ending the call with a vague promise to consider the invitation, Frank turned back to his unexpected guests, hoping they would take the hint and leave. Robert seemed to sense Frank's discomfort. "We should get going," he said, collecting Emma's coat from where she'd dropped it. "We've imposed enough on Mr. Wilson's morning." As they prepared to leave, Emma carefully placed her envelope on the coffee table. "These are thank you cards from my whole class. My teacher had everyone make one after I told them what happened." Frank nodded awkwardly, walking them to the door. As Emma and Diane stepped into the hallway with Max, Robert lingered behind. "Mr. Wilson," he said quietly, "my daughter has suffered from severe anxiety since we lost our previous dog last year. Since the rescue yesterday, she hasn't had a single panic attack." He extended his hand again. "You didn't just save Max." Frank shook the man's hand reflexively, unsure how to respond to such earnestness. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a formal-looking invitation. "The fire department dropped this off at our house, not knowing where you lived. It's for the recognition ceremony." He placed it beside Emma's envelope. No pressure, but it would mean the world to Emma. After the door closed behind the Thompson family, Frank stood motionless in the sudden silence of his apartment. He looked at the two envelopes on his coffee table, one colorful and handmade, the other official with the fire department's emblem. His eyes drifted to the scrapbook Emma had been examining. The Riverside Hotel disaster had been the beginning of the end of his career. 3 civilians lost, a dozen injured, including Frank himself. The investigation had cleared him of wrongdoing, but he knew better. He should have recognized the structural weaknesses sooner, evacuated the upper floors faster. The nightmares had lasted for months, accelerating his decision to retire early. According to his therapist, whom he'd stopped seeing shortly after Margaret's diagnosis, the isolation Frank had created for himself had begun even before her death. Frank picked up the official invitation, his hands trembling slightly. The ceremony was scheduled for next Friday evening. His former colleagues would be there, expecting the Frank Wilson they remembered, confident, sociable, strong. Not this hollow shell who could barely handle a brief visit from a grateful family. In the kitchen, he swallowed another pain reliever and decided to lie down. His body still ached from yesterday's exertion, and the unexpected social interaction had drained what little energy he had. As he passed the window, Frank noticed it had begun snowing again, fat flakes drifting lazily from a steel-gray sky. He turned on the small television in his bedroom, something he rarely did during daylight hours. The local news was showing footage of road crews preparing for the incoming storm. "Forecasters are calling this potentially the worst blizzard in 30 years, the meteorologist was saying, gesturing to a massive system moving across the weather map. "We're expecting up to 3 feet of accumulation in the metropolitan area, with high winds creating significant drifting." Frank closed his eyes, listening to the warnings about power outages and travel restrictions. Outside his window, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in fresh white, burying everything beneath its silent weight. 3 days later, Frank found himself reluctantly standing inside the auditorium of Lakeside Elementary School, surrounded by dozens of excited children and smiling teachers. The massive blizzard had passed, leaving the city buried under nearly 3 feet of snow, and he had almost used that as an excuse not to attend. But the road crews had worked tirelessly to clear the main streets, eliminating his easiest justification for staying home. Frank tugged uncomfortably at his tie. The formal suit, the only one he owned, hung slightly loose on his frame. He hadn't worn it since Margaret's funeral, and the memory clung to the fabric like a lingering scent. The polyester blend felt restrictive after years of comfortable flannel and denim. "And here is our local hero," announced Principal Garcia at the microphone, gesturing toward Frank with an enthusiastic sweep of her arm. The children erupted in applause, some standing on their chairs for a better view, despite teachers' gentle admonishments. Frank's face flushed with embarrassment as he shuffled toward the small stage. In the front row, he spotted Emma Thompson waving frantically, Mac sitting obediently beside her, now sporting a small vest with official school mascot embroidered on the side. Robert and Diane sat nearby, nodding encouragingly. The walk to the microphone felt interminable. Frank had faced burning buildings with less trepidation than he now felt facing these expectant young faces. When he finally reached the podium, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm not a hero," Frank began, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Actually, what I did was very dangerous, and none of you should—" A middle-aged teacher approached, adjusting the microphone that had been set too high. "Perhaps you could tell them about safety, Mr. Wilson," she suggested gently, her eyes crinkling with understanding. Frank looked at her more closely, noticing something familiar in her features. She extended her hand. "Jessica Miller," she introduced herself. "My husband was Officer David Miller." Frank felt his stomach drop. David Miller had been one of the police officers who died in the Riverside fire while trying to evacuate the top floor. One of the three Frank couldn't save. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, waiting for the accusation, the blame, the exposure of his failure that he was certain would follow. Instead, Jessica smiled warmly. "David always talked about how meticulous you were about safety protocols. That's why I thought you'd be perfect to kick off our new safety club." Frank stared at her, momentarily speechless. Of all the reactions he'd imagined from the widow of a man he'd failed to save, forgiveness had never been among them. Principal Garcia cleared her throat gently, reminding Frank of the waiting audience. He turned back to the sea of expectant faces, finding his voice. "Safety around ice is pretty simple," he began, gradually finding his rhythm. "If you don't know it's solid, stay off it. Period." For the next 2 hours, Frank found himself moving from classroom to classroom, discussing frozen lake safety, home fire prevention, and basic first aid. The children watched him with rapt attention, asking surprisingly intelligent questions. For the first time in years, Frank felt his words mattered, that his experience had value beyond the memories that haunted him. "Mr. Wilson, how do you know if ice is thick enough?" asked a freckle-faced boy in the third-grade class. "You don't guess," Frank replied firmly. 4 inches minimum for walking, and even then, you check every few steps. Better yet, leave it to the professionals. In another classroom, he demonstrated stop, drop, and roll, his stiff joints protesting as he lowered himself to the classroom floor. The children's delighted giggles at seeing an adult on the ground made the discomfort worthwhile. During the lunch break that followed, Frank sat awkwardly at a table in the teacher's lounge, picking at a sandwich from the catered spread. The door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped through. "They finally got you out of that cave you've been living in," said Jennifer Matthews, a broad smile spreading across her weathered face. Frank stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "Jennifer!" His former partner crossed the room in long strides and pulled him into a fierce hug. Unlike Frank, Jennifer had remained with the department, her dark hair now streaked with gray, new lines around her eyes telling of 7 more years fighting fires since they'd last partnered. "Sam told me they managed to drag you out," she said, releasing him from the embrace but keeping her hands on his shoulders, examining him critically. "Margaret would be furious knowing you've hidden from the world this long." "I wasn't hiding," Frank protested feebly. "I just didn't have anything to offer." Jennifer shook her head disapprovingly. That's why I brought this. She handed Frank a manila folder. Sam found out the Riverside investigation has been reopened. New evidence suggests it wasn't your fault, Frank. The sprinkler systems were sabotaged. Frank sank back into his chair, hands trembling as he opened the folder. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of those deaths, believing he'd failed to properly assess the building's structural integrity, that his miscalculation had cost lives. The preliminary report stated that the main water connection to the sprinkler system had been deliberately disabled, with signs of tampering that had been overlooked in the original investigation. The building's owner, Marcus Geller, was now under scrutiny for insurance fraud. "This can't be right," Frank murmured, scanning the documents. "We checked the systems during the quarterly inspection just 3 weeks before." "Exactly," Jennifer replied, sitting across from him. "Someone tampered with them after your inspection but before the fire." As Frank processed this information, a shrill alarm pierced the air, followed by Principal Garcia's voice over the intercom. "Fire! This is not a drill. Please proceed to your designated evacuation points immediately." Frank was on his feet instantly, decades of training taking over. Jennifer was already moving toward the door, her posture shifting into the alert stance of an active firefighter. Jessica Miller burst into the room, her face pale. "The east wing is blocked by snow that slid from the roof," she explained rapidly. "And there are children trapped in the library." Frank assessed the situation quickly, noting the looks of panic beginning to form on the faces of the teachers gathering in the hallway. Without conscious thought, he stepped into command mode. "Jennifer, organize the evacuation through the west exits. Jessica, I need you to show me the building layout and where the library is." Jessica pulled a laminated emergency map from the wall, pointing to the library's location. "Down this corridor, turn left, then right at the end of the hall." Frank nodded, already moving. "Keep everyone calm and get them outside. The fire department should be here soon." Jennifer caught his arm. "You're not active duty anymore, Frank." "Those kids don't have time to wait," he replied, echoing his words from the frozen lake. Frank moved swiftly through the corridors, the smell of smoke growing stronger with each turn. The fire had started in the boiler room, he realized, and was spreading rapidly through the old building's ventilation system. The library was at the end of a hallway already partially filled with smoke. When he reached the library doors, he found 5 terrified children and a library assistant huddled near the windows. Among them was Emma, separated from her class during the confusion. "Mr. Frank!" she cried, running toward him. "Everyone stay calm," Frank instructed, mentally counting heads. "We're going to move quickly and quietly. Cover your mouths with your sleeves and stay low." The library assistant, a young woman barely out of college, looked at Frank with frightened eyes. "The main hallway is filling with smoke. How do we get out?" Frank was about to answer when a thunderous explosion shook the building, likely a gas line, followed by the sickening sound of collapsing ceiling tiles and support beams from the corridor they'd need to use. Moving to the doorway, Frank saw that their escape route was now blocked by debris and intensifying flames. The fire was spreading faster than it should, feeding on the old wooden structure and outdated furnishings. Emma gripped his hand, her face white with fear. "Are we trapped?" Frank felt the old panic of the Riverside disaster returning. The sensation of being cornered, of bearing responsibility for innocent lives with no clear exit. He looked at the frightened faces of the children, at Emma, who trusted him completely, and knew he couldn't fail again. He drew a deep breath, forcing himself to think systematically as he'd been trained. The library had windows, but they were 15 feet above the snowdrifts below, too high for the children to jump safely. The ventilation system might offer a route, but would also be drawing smoke directly from the fire. Frank led the group away from the doors as the smoke began seeping in. "Get on the floor where the air is cleaner," he instructed, his mind racing through options. The library assistant pointed toward a storage closet. "There's a maintenance access panel in there that connects to the science lab next door. Would that help?" Frank felt a surge of hope. "Show me," As they moved toward the closet, Frank caught sight of Emma's pale, determined face. In her eyes, he saw absolute trust, the same trust he'd seen in the eyes of countless people he'd rescued throughout his career, the same trust he'd seen in the eyes of those he couldn't save at the Riverside Hotel. The heat intensified as Frank assessed their dwindling options. The main corridor was completely blocked by fallen debris, and smoke was growing thicker by the minute. The children had begun coughing, and the library assistant looked on the verge of passing out. "Everyone on the floor now," Frank ordered, remembering that air near the ground contained less smoke. "Cover your mouths and noses with your sleeves." Frank quickly examined the building plans Jessica had shown him. There was a ventilation duct connecting the library to an adjacent room, which in turn led to a secondary corridor potentially still accessible. The problem was that the duct access was high on the wall. The heat intensified as Frank surveyed his options. The main corridor was completely blocked by the fallen debris, and the smoke was growing thicker with each passing breath. The children were beginning to cough, and the library assistant looked pale, close to fainting. "Everyone get down on the floor now," Frank ordered, remembering that air closest to the ground contained less smoke. "Cover your mouths and noses with your sleeves." Frank quickly examined the building's layout that Jessica had shown him earlier. There was a ventilation duct connecting the library to an adjacent room, which in turn opened onto a secondary corridor that might still be accessible. The problem was that the duct access was high on the wall. "We need a ladder or something to stack," Frank muttered, feeling the pain in his injured shoulder protest as he pushed a heavy bookshelf against the wall. "There's a library ladder over there," Emma exclaimed, pointing to a corner where a rolling metal ladder used for reaching high shelves stood. With the assistant's help, Frank positioned the ladder beneath the ventilation grate. Using a letter opener from the desk, he quickly unscrewed the metal covering. The opening was tight, but large enough for the children to crawl through. "Emma, you're going first," he instructed, helping the girl up the ladder. "Crawl straight ahead until you find another grate, then tell me what you see." Emma nodded bravely, her face streaked with tears but determined. Frank lifted her into the duct, wincing as his shoulder screamed in protest. One by one, he helped the other children up, constantly checking the library doors where smoke now seeped through in ominous tendrils. Outside, he could hear sirens approaching. The fire department had arrived, but Frank knew they wouldn't reach this section of the building in time. The fire was spreading too rapidly through the old structure. "Mr. Frank," Emma's voice echoed from inside the duct. "I found the other room. There's no fire here." Relief washed over Frank as he helped the last child into the opening. Only the library assistant remained, a young woman barely out of college who looked at Frank with terrified eyes. "Your turn," Frank said, steadying the ladder. The duct groaned slightly under the weight of the previous occupants, and Frank realized it likely wouldn't hold his weight. At 6'1", and still carrying the solid frame of his firefighting days, he would need to find another way out. The assistant hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll find another route," Frank assured her, helping her up the ladder. "Go straight ahead and follow Emma. When you get to the other room, turn right in the hallway. You'll find the emergency exit." As the assistant disappeared into the duct, Frank closed the library door behind him, trying to buy a few more minutes by containing the advancing fire. Alone now, he felt the familiar grip of panic. Flashbacks from Riverside came in waves, the heat, the screams, the weight of responsibility for lives lost. But this time was different. The children were on their way to safety. He hadn't failed them. With renewed determination, Frank covered his face with his jacket, now damp with sweat, and crouched low, moving toward the only remaining exit, a window at the end of the side corridor. The fire was advancing quickly, fed by the old building's ventilation system and decades of varnished wood. The window was blocked by the accumulated snow from outside. With a cry of frustration and pain, Frank used a chair to break the glass, then began frantically digging through the packed snow. From outside he could hear voices. He's still in there. The retired firefighter. It was Jessica's voice. Franco, where are you? Sam's voice boomed through a megaphone. East window, Frank shouted, coughing violently as the air became unbreathable. Moments later, the snow began to move from the other side as hands dug to reach him. Frank felt fresh air before he saw the faces of the firefighters creating an opening. Hurry up, you stubborn old man! A young firefighter extended his hand, pulling Frank through the opening, just as the corridor ceiling collapsed behind him. Frank fell into the snow, gasping for air as paramedics rushed toward him. Through the chaos, he saw Emma running to him, followed by Jessica. You did it! You saved everyone again! Emma shouted, throwing her arms around him despite the paramedics' protests. Miss, please, we need to examine him, a paramedic said, gently prying Emma away. The children? Frank asked between coughs. All accounted for, Jessica confirmed, her eyes shining with tears. Thanks to you. As the paramedics placed an oxygen mask over his face, Frank caught sight of Jennifer standing with Sam near a fire truck, both watching him with a mixture of exasperation and pride. The scene blurred as exhaustion overtook him, the adrenaline ebbing from his system. Hours later, Frank awoke in a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors creating a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. The room was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts, an explosion of color in the sterile white environment. Sam sat dozing in a chair beside the bed. Jennifer was leafing through a magazine by the window, and Jessica stood examining the collection of get-well cards that had already arrived. Well, looks like you decided to come out of retirement in style, Sam commented, awakening as Frank stirred. Frank tried to sit up, feeling the pull of an IV in his arm and the tightness of bandages around his hands where he'd cut them on the broken window glass. The children? All fine, Jessica answered, moving closer to the bed. Thanks to you? Jennifer approached, holding the folder she'd shown Frank before the fire broke out. Did you read this before the chaos started? Frank nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation still sinking in. It wasn't my fault. Never was, Sam confirmed, leaning forward in his chair. And now you have a second chance if you want it. Frank looked at them questioningly. The department needs someone to head up our community safety education program, Sam explained. Someone with experience, someone the public already trusts. He gestured toward a stack of newspapers on the bedside table, each featuring the story of Frank's second rescue in a week. I'm too old, Frank protested weakly. Didn't look that way today, Jennifer countered. Besides, we're not asking you to run into burning buildings anymore, just to teach others how to prevent fires in the first place. A nurse entered, checking Frank's vitals and adjusting his IV. You have more visitors, Mr. Wilson, but I've told them they need to wait. You need rest. Through the partially open door, Frank could see Emma and her parents in the hallway, Max sitting patiently at their feet. Beyond them stood a group of firefighters, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, faces he recognized from his years of service. They've been here for hours, Jessica said, following his gaze. The waiting room is full of people who want to thank you. Frank sank back against the pillows, overwhelmed. For 3 years, he'd existed in self-imposed isolation, convinced he had nothing left to offer the world. Now, suddenly, people were looking to him again, counting on him, believing in him. I don't know if I can be what they expect, he admitted quietly. Sam stood, resting a hand on Frank's shoulder. Nobody's expecting anything, Franco. Just be yourself, the guy who can't help jumping into frozen lakes and burning buildings to save others. He smiled. Some things never change. As his friends stepped out to allow him to rest, Frank found himself alone with his thoughts. On the television mounted in the corner, a local news station was showing footage of the school fire, interviewing children who had been safely evacuated. Emma's face appeared on screen, the reporter kneeling to reach her level. He's my hero, she was saying, her expression earnest. He saved Max from the frozen lake, and then he saved us from the fire. He's like a superhero, but real." Frank closed his eyes, feeling something shift within him, a crack in the wall of grief and guilt he'd built around himself. Margaret had always told him his need to protect others was both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. "You can't save everyone, Frank," she'd say, "but that never stops you from trying." 3 months later, Frank walked through the same park where everything had begun, but this time he wasn't alone. Emma and Max ran ahead, chasing squirrels through the new spring grass, while Jessica walked beside him. In his pocket, Frank carried his new badge, not as an active firefighter, but as the official safety consultant for schools and instructor for the junior firefighter program. "Know what Margaret would say if she could see us now?" Jessica asked, intertwining her fingers with his. Frank smiled, looking at the lake, now completely thawed, its surface sparkling in the morning sunlight. "She'd say, 'About time, you stubborn old fool.'" Jessica laughed. David would say exactly the same thing. When they reached the bench where Frank had once sat alone contemplating the frozen lake, they found a newly installed plaque. "Hero's Bench," in honor of Frank Wilson, who taught us it's never too late to save a life, including your own. "I still find this embarrassing," Frank grumbled, though his smile betrayed his words. "Better get used to it," Jessica teased. "The mayor wants you to speak at the opening of the new training center." Frank watched Emma playing with Max, the girl whose smile had helped thaw the frozen lake that had formed in his heart after losing Margaret. "You know," he said finally, "for a man who thought his rescue days were over, I've been doing quite a bit of it lately." Jessica squeezed his hand. "Some people are born for it." "For rescuing others?" Frank asked. "No," Jessica smiled, kissing his cheek. "For allowing themselves to be rescued too." The antiseptic smell of the hospital room had become familiar to Frank over the 3 days of his stay. The doctors had insisted on keeping him for observation after the smoke inhalation and minor burns he'd sustained in the school fire. Now, as morning light filtered through the half-drawn blinds, Frank awakened to find his room transformed into something resembling a gift shop rather than a medical facility. Every surface was covered with flowers in colorful vases, hand-drawn cards from schoolchildren, fruit baskets, and even a few stuffed animals. A particularly large teddy bear wearing a firefighter's hat sat in the corner, a gift from the kindergarten class at Lakeside Elementary. Frank shifted in the bed, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the bandages on his hands. The cuts from the broken window glass were healing, but still tender. He reached for the water glass on his bedside table, navigating around a towering arrangement of sunflowers. "Need help with that?" Frank turned to see Sam awakening in the visitor's chair, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The fire chief had apparently spent the night, his uniform jacket draped over the back of the chair. "I've got it," Frank replied, taking a sip of water. "Don't you have a department to run?" Sam stretched, his back cracking audibly. "Jenkins is covering. I wanted to be here when the doctor makes rounds." Jennifer and Jessica entered the room moments later carrying coffee cups. Jennifer handed one to Sam before settling into the second visitor's chair, while Jessica approached Frank's bed with a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, adjusting his pillows without being asked. "Like I could go home?" Frank replied, the hint of gruffness in his voice unable to mask the appreciation in his eyes. A nurse bustled in, checking Frank's vital signs and making notes on his chart. "Your recovery is remarkable for someone your age, Mr. Wilson," she said cheerfully. "Dr. Bennett will be by shortly to discuss discharge options." After she left, Frank surveyed the room filled with tokens of gratitude. Among the cards, he noticed several drawings from Emma, each depicting him in increasingly heroic poses, first rescuing Max from the lake, then carrying children from the burning school. In the latest, he appeared to be wearing a cape. "That child has quite an imagination," he murmured. "She's your biggest fan," Jessica confirmed. "The entire school is, actually. The principal called this morning to check on you. Sam leaned forward, coffee cup in hand. Speaking of fans, the media requests are piling up. Local stations, newspapers, even the national morning shows want interviews. Frank frowned. No interviews. Thought you'd say that, Sam nodded, unsurprised. But there's something else you should know. He exchanged glances with Jennifer, who pulled a document from her bag. The investigation into the Riverside Hotel incident has officially been reopened, Jennifer explained, handing Frank the papers. The FBI is involved now since it appears to be part of a larger insurance fraud scheme. Frank scanned the document, his hands trembling slightly. The preliminary findings confirmed what Jennifer had begun to tell him before the school fire. The sprinkler system had been deliberately sabotaged, with evidence suggesting the hotel's owner, Marcus Geller, had orchestrated the scheme for the insurance payout. They found evidence of accelerants in locations that matched the ignition points from the original investigation, Jennifer continued. It wasn't just negligence, Frank. It was deliberate arson. All these years. Frank's voice trailed off. The weight of guilt he'd carried for the 3 deaths at the Riverside had shaped his entire existence since that day. The possibility that he might truly be blameless was almost too much to comprehend. Jessica gently placed her hand over his bandaged one. David always said you were too hard on yourself about that fire, she said quietly. He told me that if anyone could have saved more people that day, it would have been you. Frank looked at her in surprise. After losing her husband in the Riverside fire, Jessica had more reason than anyone to blame him. Instead, she offered absolution he hadn't dared seek. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Wilson, you have quite a line of visitors waiting. Should I send them in a few at a time? Before Frank could respond, Emma burst into the room, her parents following apologetically behind. The girl carried a large envelope decorated with glitter and superhero stickers. Mr. Frank, look what we made, Emma exclaimed, carefully placing the envelope on the bed. Everyone in my class signed it. Frank opened the envelope to find a large card with Get Well Superhero written in bold letters across the top. Inside, dozens of children had signed their names and drawn small pictures. And look, Emma pointed to the doorway, where Max appeared, sporting a new vest that read, Superhero's Best Friend, in sequined letters. Emma insisted on the sequins, Diane explained with a smile, as Robert tried unsuccessfully to keep the excited dog from jumping onto the bed. It's fine, Frank assured them, surprised to find himself genuinely pleased by the visit. The next hour passed in a blur of visitors. Firefighters from his old station, teachers from the school, even the mayor stopped by briefly with a certificate of civic heroism. Frank found himself unexpectedly engaged in conversations he would have avoided just weeks earlier. When the room finally cleared in the afternoon, leaving just Sam, Jennifer, and Jessica, Dr. Bennett arrived to discuss Frank's discharge. Your lungs sound good considering the smoke exposure, the doctor said, removing his stethoscope. I'm approving your release for tomorrow morning, but I want you taking it easy for at least 2 weeks. After the doctor left, Sam cleared his throat. So, about that proposal I mentioned earlier. Frank raised an eyebrow. What proposal? Sam produced an official department folder. The Community Safety Education Program. We've been wanting to launch it for years, but never had the right person to lead it. He placed the folder on Frank's lap. The position includes school visits, community workshops, and overseeing the junior firefighter training program. Frank opened the folder hesitantly. Inside was a formal job description, along with an ID badge already printed with his name and photo, clearly taken from his old department records. You planned this before the school fire, Frank observed. Jennifer smiled. After the lake rescue went viral, Sam realized you were the perfect face for the program. The school fire just confirmed what we already knew. You're still the best at what you do. Frank examined the badge thoughtfully. It wasn't an active firefighter's credential, but it represented connection, purpose, things he'd deliberately severed from his life after Margaret's death. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's been a long time since I've been part of anything." "Just think about it," Sam replied, standing to leave. "The position starts in 2 weeks. Perfect timing for your recovery." As Sam and Jennifer prepared to depart, Jessica lingered. "I'll stay a while longer if that's okay," she said, settling into the chair Sam had vacated. When they were alone, an awkward silence fell between them. Frank found himself studying Jessica's face, noticing the strength in her features, the calm intelligence in her eyes. So different from Margaret, yet similarly kind. "You don't have to babysit me," Frank said finally. "I'm sure you have better things to do on a Saturday." Jessica smiled. "Actually, I don't. Grading papers can wait." She hesitated, then added, "Besides, I've enjoyed reconnecting with you despite the circumstances." Frank was surprised to realize he felt the same way. For 3 years, he'd avoided all connections to his past life, convinced they would only bring pain, yet sitting with Jessica felt unexpectedly comfortable. "How did you do it?" he asked suddenly. "After David, after the fire, how did you keep going?" Jessica considered the question carefully. "Not well at first," she admitted. "I was angry, devastated. I blamed everyone, the hotel, the fire department, God." She paused. "Sometimes I even blamed you." Frank nodded, unsurprised. "But then I found the journal David kept," she continued. "He wrote about his colleagues, especially you. How much he respected your caution, your thoroughness. He wrote that if he ever got in trouble on the job, he hoped you'd be the one leading the rescue." Frank looked away, emotion threatening to overcome him. "That's when I realized that living in grief and anger wasn't honoring his memory," Jessica said softly. "Teaching was my way back. Helping children, watching them grow. It gave me purpose again." Frank thought about the job offer in the folder. "And you think this safety program could do that for me?" "I think you already found your purpose again," Jessica replied. "At the lake, and then at the school. The program just gives you a framework for what you're already doing." As evening approached, Jessica gathered her belongings. "I should let you rest," she said, but hesitated at the door. "When you're discharged tomorrow, would you like to get coffee sometime next week? There's a nice cafe near the park." The invitation caught Frank off guard. It sounded suspiciously like a social engagement, something he'd avoided for years. Yes, he found himself saying. "That would be nice." Jessica's smile brightened her entire face. "Good. It's a date." She stopped, flushing slightly. "I mean, not a date, just a coffee," Frank supplied, surprised to find himself enjoying her momentary flustering. "I'd like that." After Jessica left, Frank examined the job offer more closely. The position description highlighted community engagement, safety education, and mentoring young people interested in emergency services. It wasn't fighting fires, but it was passing on the knowledge that might prevent them. The following morning, as Frank signed his discharge papers, the nurse handed him a small bag containing his personal effects. "Your phone's been buzzing all night," she informed him. "Quite popular, aren't you?" Frank checked the device to find several messages from Sam, one from Jennifer, and even one from Emma's parents with a photo of Emma and Max wearing matching superhero capes. Making a decision, he dialed Sam's number. "Franco," Sam answered on the first ring. "Tell me you're accepting the position." "On one condition," Frank replied. "I want to be kept in the loop on the Riverside investigation." "Done," Sam agreed without hesitation. "When can you start?" 2 weeks, Frank said, thinking of his coffee plans with Jessica. "I have some personal matters to attend to first." As he hung up, Frank didn't realize that his decision would place him at the center of an investigation that would reveal truths far darker about the Riverside Hotel fire than anyone could have imagined. Frank stood at the entrance of Station 37, his hand hovering over the door handle. It had been 3 years since he'd walked through these doors, since he'd breathed in the distinctive scent of diesel fuel, rubber hoses, and floor cleaner that permeated every firehouse he'd ever known. For 27 years, that smell had meant home. Now it filled him with a conflicting mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. "You going in? Or are you planning to admire the architecture all day?" Jennifer's voice came from behind him, carrying the good-natured teasing that had characterized their partnership. Frank turned, grateful for her presence. "Just getting my bearings." "Some things haven't changed," she assured him, pushing the door open. "The coffee is still terrible." The moment Frank stepped inside, the station fell silent, then erupted into applause. Firefighters, some familiar faces many knew, surrounded him, offering handshakes, backslaps, and warm welcomes. Their genuine enthusiasm overwhelmed Frank, who had expected polite acknowledgement at best, awkward pity at worst. "The prodigal son returns," Sam boomed, emerging from his office. He guided Frank through the crowd to a desk positioned near the training room, not far from where Frank's captain's desk had once stood. A new credential badge and key card lay waiting. "Community Safety Director," Frank read from the badge, raising an eyebrow. "I thought I was just a consultant." Sam shrugged. Budget office needed an official title. Besides, director carries more weight when you're dealing with school boards and city officials. Jennifer helped Frank settle in, showing him the updated filing system and the new computer setup. "Everything's digital now," she explained, navigating through folders of safety presentations and training materials. "But we kept some of the old training manuals you developed. Nobody could improve on them." Throughout the morning, a steady stream of firefighters stopped by Frank's desk, introducing themselves or, in the case of veterans, reminiscing about past calls. Frank was surprised to find himself remembering not just the fires and rescues, but the camaraderie, the shared purpose that had defined his career. "Wilson, right? From the school fire?" A young firefighter with a lieutenant's insignia approached. "Jason Michaels." My crew responded to that call. That ventilation shaft evacuation was brilliant, old-school tactics that saved those kids. Frank nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just applied the basics." "That's what I tell my probies," Michaels said. "Basics save lives." They all watched that lake rescue video, by the way. Required viewing now. After lunch, Frank found himself alone in the records room, reviewing the Riverside Hotel files Sam had pulled for him. The reopened investigation had yielded disturbing inconsistencies in the original owner statements. Marcus Geller, the hotel's owner, had claimed to be out of town when the fire occurred, but newly discovered security camera footage from a nearby bank showed his car parked 3 blocks away just hours before the first alarm. Frank pored over floor plans and inspection reports, noting that the hotel's sprinkler system had passed inspection just 3 weeks before the fatal fire. Yet the system had failed catastrophically during the blaze, allowing the fire to spread rapidly through the upper floors where Officer Miller and 2 guests had died. "Finding anything?" Sam asked, appearing in the doorway. Frank tapped the inspection report. "The maintenance log shows the sprinkler system was serviced 2 days before the fire, after our regular inspection. That wasn't in the original investigation file." "Convenient timing," Sam observed grimly. Frank's first official presentation as safety director came the following day at Parkside Elementary. Standing before a gymnasium full of children, he felt a moment of panic until he spotted Emma in the front row, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. "Who knows what to do if you see someone fall through ice?" Frank began, surprised at how naturally the teaching role came to him. "Call for help! Don't go on the ice yourself!" several children shouted. "That's right," Frank nodded, using a photo of Max's rescue as a visual aid. "Even adults shouldn't go on ice unless they're trained professionals. This puppy was very lucky, and so was I." The children listened with rapt attention as Frank explained ice safety, home fire prevention, and how to call 911 properly. Their earnest questions and eager participation reminded Frank of the junior firefighter programs he'd helped develop years ago. As the presentation ended, Emma approached him proudly. "I'm going to be a firefighter when I grow up," she announced. "Mom says I can join the junior program when I'm 12. Frank smiled, touched by her determination. "You'll make a fine firefighter, Emma." Later that afternoon, Frank met Jessica at the cafe they'd agreed upon, a cozy spot overlooking the park where Max's rescue had occurred. Frank arrived early, securing a table by the window, nervously adjusting his collar. He'd changed shirts twice before leaving home, feeling foolish each time. When Jessica entered, wearing a simple blue dress instead of her usual teacher's attire, Frank stood awkwardly, uncertain of the proper greeting. She solved the dilemma by giving him a quick hug. "You look nice," she said, settling across from him. "How does it feel being back at the station?" "Strange," Frank admitted. "Familiar but different. Like visiting your childhood home after someone else has been living there for years." After ordering coffee, they fell into comfortable conversation about the safety program, Jessica's teaching, and the ongoing cleanup at the school after the fire. As their cups emptied, Jessica suggested a walk. The park was transforming as spring advanced, the last patches of snow melting away, revealing tender green shoots pushing through the soil. They strolled along the lakeside path where everything had begun. "David used to bring me here on Sundays," Jessica said softly. "He loved watching the birds return in spring." Frank nodded, understanding the bittersweet nature of such memories. "Margaret planted bulbs in every apartment we ever lived in. Seeing daffodils still makes me look for her." They walked in companionable silence, both acutely aware that they were navigating the delicate terrain of moving forward while honoring their pasts. "Did David ever mention concerns about the Riverside Hotel before the fire?" Frank asked suddenly. Jessica looked surprised. "Yes, actually. About a month before, he mentioned that the security cameras in the stairwells weren't working properly during a routine patrol. He filed a report with hotel management." She frowned. "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to piece together what really happened," Frank replied. "The investigation is uncovering some troubling inconsistencies." As they continued walking, Frank explained the reopened investigation, the evidence of tampering, and his own suspicions about the hotel owner's involvement. That property was struggling financially, he concluded. The insurance payout was substantial, far more than the building's actual value. Their path had led them to the vacant lot where the Riverside Hotel once stood. Now surrounded by chain-link fencing and overgrown with weeds, the empty space stood as a grim memorial to the lives lost there. Frank stared at it, memories of that night flooding back, the intense heat, the collapsing stairwell, the desperate radio calls for backup that came too late. "Frank," Jessica touched his arm, pointing across the street. "Isn't that—" A luxury sedan had pulled up at the adjacent parking lot. A well-dressed man in his 60s stepped out, speaking animatedly on his phone while gesturing toward the empty lot. "Marcus Geller," Frank confirmed, recognizing the hotel's former owner from news photographs. Without discussion, they moved closer, pretending to admire a storefront while remaining within earshot. "Should be finalized next month," Geller was saying. "The city approved the zoning change yesterday. Yes, condominiums with commercial space on the ground floor. The insurance money was just sitting there earning nothing." When Geller turned in their direction, Frank instinctively stepped back, pulling Jessica with him. But not before Geller's expression changed from satisfaction to unmistakable recognition and alarm upon seeing Frank. The man quickly ended his call and hurried back to his car, casting nervous glances over his shoulder before driving away much faster than the posted limit. "He recognized you," Jessica observed. "And he didn't like seeing me," Frank added grimly. Back at the station the following day, Frank mentioned the encounter to Jennifer, while they reviewed training schedules for the junior firefighter program. "Could be nothing," she said. "Or it could be the guilty conscience of a man who committed insurance fraud and got 3 people killed in the process." "I want to look at the insurance settlement records," Frank decided. "If the payout was inflated, there might be evidence in the appraisal." Jennifer frowned. "Those would be confidential business records, Franco. We'd need a subpoena." "Maybe not," Frank replied. "Insurance filings for commercial properties are public record when they involve structural losses. I just need to know where to look." By late afternoon, Frank had discovered that Geller's insurance settlement had been nearly double the property's last tax assessment value. More disturbing was the connection Frank found while cross-referencing the building inspector who had approved the Riverside safety systems. Martin Reynolds was Geller's first cousin, a relationship neither man had disclosed during the original investigation. "This gets worse by the day," Sam muttered when Frank shared his findings. "I'm forwarding this to the FBI task force. They'll want to interview you." As Frank prepared to leave that evening, he decided to make one final stop. The department's memorial wall displayed photographs of those lost in the line of duty, including the police officers who had died in fires while assisting evacuations. David Miller's photo showed a man about Frank's age when he died, with kind eyes and a serious expression. "I'll find out what really happened," Frank promised quietly. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the man observing him from across the street as he walked to his car. When Frank turned to look more closely, the figure ducked into a parked sedan and drove away. The encounter left Frank unsettled. Arriving home, he found a manila envelope that had been slid under his door. Inside was an old photograph of the Riverside Hotel on the day it opened, with Marcus Geller cutting a ceremonial ribbon. Scrawled across the bottom in red marker were the words, "Not everything buried should be dug up." Frank held the photograph with trembling hands, recognizing the veiled threat, realizing that someone was watching his movements and that by stirring the ashes of the past, he may have ignited a fire far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Frank spread the threatening photograph across Sam's desk, watching the fire chief's expression darken as he examined it. Jennifer leaned over Sam's shoulder, her lips pressing into a thin line at the sight of the message scrawled in red marker. "Not exactly subtle," she remarked, straightening up. "When did this arrive?" Sam asked, reaching for his phone. "Last night," Frank replied. "Slipped under my door while I was at the station." Sam immediately called the detective assigned to the Riverside investigation, arranging for the photograph to be collected as evidence. "They'll check for fingerprints, but I wouldn't get my hopes up," he told Frank after hanging up. "Whoever's behind this is probably smart enough to wear gloves." Frank nodded, unsurprised. "It's the timing that bothers me. Someone's watching my movements." Jennifer crossed her arms. "Think it's Geller? Or someone working for him," Frank suggested. "Either way, the message is clear. Stop investigating." The threat only strengthened Frank's determination to uncover the truth about the Riverside disaster. For the next week, he established a new routine. Mornings spent conducting safety workshops with school children, afternoons dedicated to combing through records related to the hotel fire, and evenings often spent with Jessica, their connection growing deeper with each passing day. On Wednesday, Frank was demonstrating fire extinguisher techniques to a group of junior firefighter recruits in the department's training yard when he noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A man with a telephoto lens appeared to be photographing the building. "Keep practicing the pass technique," Frank instructed the teenagers before casually walking toward the fence line for a better look. The moment Frank moved in the photographer's direction, the car engine started. By the time Frank reached the sidewalk, the vehicle had already disappeared around the corner. "Everything okay?" asked Brandon, one of the more perceptive recruits. "Just checking something," Frank replied, making a mental note of the partial license plate he'd glimpsed. "Let's see those extinguisher skills again." Later that afternoon, Frank led Emma and her safety club classmates through a practical exercise in the school gymnasium, teaching them how to check smoke detectors and identify fire hazards in a mock-up of a typical home. While the children enthusiastically searched for the deliberately planted safety violations, Frank remained vigilant, scanning the school grounds through the gym windows, searching for any sign of surveillance. "Mr. Frank, we found the overloaded outlet," Emma called proudly, drawing his attention back to the exercise. "Good catch," he praised, focusing on the children while maintaining his peripheral awareness. "What else is wrong with this setup?" The threatening photograph wasn't the only unsettling development that week. Jessica called Frank Thursday evening, her voice tense. "Someone's been in my house," she told him without preamble. Frank sat up straighter in his armchair. "Are you all right? Have you called the police?" "I'm fine. And yes, they took a report, but there wasn't much to tell them." Jessica sighed. "Nothing was stolen, just moved. My personal files about the Riverside incident were clearly rifled through. Papers that were in folders are now slightly out of order. The box was in a different position than I left it." "Stay with your sister tonight," Frank urged. "Or I can come over." "Actually, I was wondering if I could come to you," Jessica interrupted. "I'd feel safer not being alone." An hour later, they sat at Frank's kitchen table, mugs of tea growing cold as Jessica described the subtle signs of intrusion she'd discovered. "The police think I'm being paranoid," she concluded. "They said without signs of forced entry or actual theft, there's little they can do." Frank reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You're not paranoid. This is connected to the Riverside investigation." Their eyes met and held. Frank felt a surge of protectiveness, along with another emotion he'd thought long buried. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned forward. Jessica met him halfway, their lips touching in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened. When they separated, both looked equally startled by what had just happened. "I didn't plan that," Frank said softly. "Neither did I," Jessica replied, a small smile forming. "But I don't regret it." They sat in silence for a moment, the simple kitchen suddenly charged with unspoken feelings and possibilities. "I still miss her," Frank admitted quietly. "Every day." "I know," Jessica nodded. "I still miss David. I think we always will." She squeezed his hand. "But I also think they'd both want us to be happy." Later, after setting up the sofa for Jessica with spare blankets and pillows, Frank lay awake in his bedroom, thoughts racing. The kiss had awakened feelings he'd believed died with Margaret, bringing both comfort and guilt. Was it disloyal to feel this connection to someone new? Or was it, as Jessica suggested, what Margaret would have wanted for him? His personal turmoil was interrupted by his cell phone ringing at 11:47 p.m. The screen showed an unknown number. "Hello?" Frank answered cautiously. "You've already lost your wife." A digitally altered voice stated flatly, "Think carefully about what else you might lose now." The line went dead before Frank could respond. He immediately called Sam, then checked that his apartment door was securely locked before looking in on Jessica, who had fallen asleep on the couch. The implicit threat against her turned his concern into cold anger. The following day, after filing a police report about the call, Frank found himself standing before Margaret's grave for the first time in months. The cemetery was peaceful in the spring sunshine, birds singing in the trees that lined the winding paths. "I need some advice, Maggie," he said quietly, placing fresh flowers in the small vase built into the headstone. "There's someone, Jessica. You'd like her. She's kind and brave like you." He paused, throat tightening. "I feel like I'm betraying you, even though I know that's not rational." The only answer was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, but Frank found comfort in the familiar ritual of confiding in Margaret. They had shared everything for over 4 decades. Death hadn't changed his need for her counsel. "I think you'd tell me to stop being so stubborn," he continued with a sad smile. "To let myself be happy again." Frank left the cemetery feeling lighter, as though Margaret had indeed granted her blessing. His newfound peace was short-lived, however. When he arrived at the station, Jennifer waited with a grim expression and a thick file folder. "Financial records," she announced, spreading documents across his desk. The federal investigators subpoenaed Geller's bank statements. "Look at these deposits to the account of the building inspector, Martin Reynolds, Geller's cousin, all made within 2 weeks after the insurance payout." Frank examined the records, noting 3 separate transfers totaling over $200,000. "Payoff money," he concluded, "for falsifying inspection reports and possibly sabotaging the sprinkler system." "It gets worse," Jennifer continued. "Reynolds was the inspector on 6 other Geller properties that suffered accidental fires over the past decade. All resulted in substantial insurance payouts." Frank shook his head in disgust. "They've been running this scheme for years." The following day, Frank joined Emma and her parents for lunch at their favorite diner, fulfilling a promise he'd made to hear about her science fair project. As they ate, Frank noticed the same car he'd spotted outside the training yard now parked across the street. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, rising from the table. "Everything okay?" Robert asked, following Frank's gaze. "Just saw someone I know," Frank replied, not wanting to alarm them. He walked calmly toward the exit, then moved quickly around the building toward the suspicious vehicle. The car pulled away before he could reach it, but not before Frank confirmed it was the same one he'd seen previously. Someone was definitely tracking his movements. That evening, Frank confronted Sam in his office about the possibility of an insider connection to the conspiracy. "Someone is feeding information about the investigation to Geller," Frank insisted. "How else would they know about Jessica's files or my involvement?" Sam ran a hand over his face. "I've been thinking the same thing. The timing of that threat, right after you found the connection between Geller and Reynolds, is too convenient." "Who has access to the investigation files?" Frank pressed. "Too many people," Sam admitted. "The investigative team, department heads, city officials briefed on the case. It could be anyone." The following morning, Jessica received a disturbing delivery at her classroom. A bouquet of black roses with a card that read, "Widows should know when to stop asking questions." Frank immediately brought Jessica to the station to file another report. While they were there, he received a call from the building superintendent of his apartment complex, reporting suspicious activity near Frank's unit. "I installed some basic security," Frank told Jessica that evening as he demonstrated the new door alarm and window sensors in his apartment. "Not perfect, but at least we'll know if someone tries to break in." "You think they really would?" Jessica asked, worry etched on her face. "I don't think we should underestimate what they're capable of," Frank replied. "People who would commit arson for profit and let innocent people die aren't going to be stopped by basic morality." Later that night, Frank and Jessica took a walk through the park, seeking a moment of normalcy amid the escalating threats. The spring evening was mild, the park mostly empty as twilight descended. They had just reached the lake when Frank noticed a figure following them on the path, staying just at the edge of visibility. "Don't look now, but we've got company," he murmured to Jessica, guiding her to a well-lit area near a park shelter. When Frank turned to confront their shadow, the figure quickly disappeared into the trees. They cut their walk short, returning to Frank's apartment with renewed unease. The next day, Frank made a significant discovery while reviewing the personnel files of the firefighters who had died in the Riverside blaze. David Miller and the other 2 victims had all been part of a special code enforcement team that had conducted a surprise inspection at another Geller property just 3 weeks before the fatal fire. "They found serious violations," Frank told Jennifer, showing her the report. "Enough to shut the place down until repairs were made." "You think Geller targeted them specifically?" Jennifer asked, horrified. "I think they knew too much," Frank replied grimly. "And Geller couldn't risk them connecting the dots between his properties," Upon returning to his apartment after teaching a class to the junior firefighters, Frank found his worst fears confirmed. His door was slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered locking it that morning. Drawing on years of training, he approached cautiously, listening for any sound from within. The apartment had been completely ransacked, drawers emptied, furniture upended, even air vents removed from the walls. But it was what lay in the center of the living room that chilled Frank to his core. Photographs of Emma, Jessica, and the junior firefighter recruits arranged in a circle with burned matches placed around them, a clear message that Frank's past wasn't the only thing at risk, but the entire future he had begun to build. Frank stared at the circle of photos in his living room, cold fury replacing his initial shock. The burned matches surrounding images of Emma, Jessica, and his young students crossed a line. These weren't just threats against him anymore. Someone was targeting innocent people whose only crime was their connection to him. 2 police officers photographed the disturbing display while Frank kept Emma's parents on the phone, urging them to take precautions. "Keep your doors locked and stay together," he instructed. "I don't think you're in immediate danger, but I'd feel better knowing you're being careful." "Should we leave town?" Robert asked, concern evident in his voice. "A weekend trip might be wise," Frank agreed, "just until we sort this out." After hanging up, Frank called Jessica, who was still at school grading papers. "Don't go home," he said without preamble. "Come directly to the station. I'll explain when you get here." The lead detective, a no-nonsense woman named Rivera, finished documenting the scene. "This is escalating beyond intimidation, Mr. Wilson. These are explicit threats against civilians, including a child." "I'm aware," Frank replied tightly. "We'll increase patrols in your neighborhood and around the school," she continued. "But you should consider removing yourself from the investigation. Your involvement is clearly putting others at risk." Frank shook his head. "Backing off is exactly what they want. Besides, I'm not officially part of the investigation. I'm just connecting dots from my own experience." "Well, someone clearly believes you're a threat to their operation," Rivera observed, bagging the burned matches as evidence. At the fire station, Frank paced Sam's office while Jessica sat stunned after hearing about the break-in. "You need to stay with your sister in Maplewood," Frank told her, "at least until we know who's behind this." "I'm not running away," Jessica protested. "These people were involved in David's death. I deserve answers just as much as you do." "It's not about deserving answers," Frank insisted. "It's about staying alive to get them." Sam interceded. "Frank's right, Jessica. Distance would be safer for now. These people have already demonstrated they know where you both live and work." Their argument was interrupted when Jennifer burst into the office, her expression grave. "You both need to see this," she said, laying out printouts of property records and news clippings. "I've been digging into Geller's connections. He's not just some greedy hotel owner. He's connected to half the development projects in the city and has family ties to Commissioner Brandt." "The city commissioner who oversees the fire department budget?" Sam asked incredulously. Jennifer nodded. "The same one who's been pushing to reduce investigation resources for suspected arsons in low-priority areas." Frank studied the documents. "This goes higher than we thought. Geller must have protection from someone with serious influence." After much persuasion, Jessica reluctantly agreed to stay with her sister outside the city. Their goodbye in the station parking lot was emotionally charged, both aware that their budding relationship was being tested by circumstances neither had anticipated. "This isn't goodbye," Frank assured her, holding her hands in his. "Just a temporary precaution." Jessica kissed him briefly. "Find who did this, Frank. For David, for those hotel guests, and for us." As Jessica drove away, Frank felt the dual weight of responsibility and determination. He hadn't asked for this role, but having assumed it, he wouldn't back down, not when justice for 3 deaths hung in the balance. The following morning, Frank made a detour to visit Emma and her family before they left for their weekend at her grandparents' lake house. He kept his explanation vague, but emphasized the importance of their trip. "The puppy rescue video made me a bit too famous," he told Emma with a forced smile. "Some people who don't like me much are being troublesome." Emma studied him with perceptive eyes. "Is that why police cars drove by our house all night?" Frank nodded, impressed by her observation skills. "Just a precaution. Your weekend trip is perfect timing." After they departed, Frank met Jennifer at a coffee shop several blocks from the station, deliberately choosing a public location away from their usual haunts. "Sam has a confession to make," Jennifer said quietly once they were seated in a corner booth. "He's been working on this longer than he let on." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He suspected the Riverside fire was suspicious from the beginning," she explained. "But when he started asking questions, his daughter's car was vandalized with a warning message. He backed off to protect his family." Frank absorbed this revelation with growing anger. "Why didn't he tell me this before?" "He was ashamed," Jennifer replied simply. "And afraid that involving you would put you at risk too. He didn't anticipate you'd jump back into the thick of things on your own." Their discussion was interrupted when Sam himself arrived, sliding into the booth beside Jennifer with a folder tucked under his arm. "Before you say anything," Sam began, raising a hand to forestall Frank's questions, "I know I should have told you. But after what happened to Karen's car, with fire chiefs should mind their own business scratched into the paint, I had a teenage daughter to think about." Frank's expression softened slightly. As a former firefighter, he understood the calculus of protecting family above all else. "What changed now?" he asked instead. "They've already made threats against you and Jessica," Sam replied grimly. "There's no point in hiding what I know anymore." He opened the folder, revealing photographs of multiple buildings. "These are all Geller properties that suffered accidental fires over the past decade. The pattern is identical. Buildings with declining profits suddenly burn, insurance pays out above market value, and Geller reinvests in more profitable ventures." Frank studied the photos, recognizing the pattern. The Riverside was his biggest score. "And his deadliest mistake," Jennifer added. The other fires were carefully contained, with evacuations completed before major damage. The Riverside was different. Something went wrong with their plan. "The surprise inspection," Frank murmured. "David and the others must have discovered something during their visit that forced Geller to accelerate his timeline." They spent the next hour developing a theory. Geller had planned the Riverside fire, but David Miller and the other inspectors had inadvertently disrupted the schedule by discovering violations that would have brought increased scrutiny. Geller had been forced to act before proper preparations were complete, resulting in the deaths that transformed insurance fraud into manslaughter. "We need proof," Sam concluded. "Something that directly links Geller to the tampering of the sprinkler systems." Frank thought for a moment. "What about Arnold Merkley? He was Geller's accountant for years before retiring. If anyone knows about suspicious financial transactions, it would be him." Jennifer quickly searched on her phone. "Merkley is at Sunshine Valley Retirement Home now, has been for 2 years." That afternoon, Frank visited Sunshine Valley, introducing himself to Merkley as a fire safety consultant reviewing historic cases. The elderly accountant was initially reluctant to discuss his former client, but became more forthcoming when Frank mentioned the deaths at the Riverside. "I always kept proper books," Merkley insisted, his rheumy eyes blinking rapidly. "But there were other transactions Marcus handled personally. Cash withdrawals before each renovation project. Substantial amounts." "Payoffs?" Frank suggested. Merkley shrugged. "I never asked. In my position, it was better not to know certain things. But after the Riverside incident, I insisted on retiring. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, even for money." Frank left with nothing concrete but a stronger conviction that Geller's operations couldn't have succeeded without significant corruption within the city's inspection and approval processes. Back at the station, Jennifer made a breakthrough while searching through archived records. "Look at this," she called to Frank, pointing at her computer screen. It was misfiled in the old system, but I found the original maintenance log for the Riverside sprinkler system. The final inspection signature doesn't match Reynolds' other documentation. It's forged. Frank examined the digital document. This proves the system was never properly inspected before the fire. Can we trace who actually signed off on it? Working on it, Jennifer replied, already sending the document to the forensic team. Hours later, Frank received an anonymous text. Warehouse 17, Industrial Park, midnight. Evidence about Riverside sprinklers. Frank showed the message to Sam, who immediately shook his head. Obvious trap. Or someone on the inside who's afraid to come forward officially, Frank countered. Either way, you're not going alone, Sam insisted. Frank considered the risks. If it is a source, they might bolt if they see multiple people. I need to go alone, but with backup nearby. After lengthy debate, they compromised. Frank would approach alone, with Sam and a trusted detective waiting out of sight. Before leaving, Frank gathered all the evidence they'd collected and gave copies to Jennifer. If I don't check in by 1 a.m., take these directly to State Police Captain Hargrove, he instructed. Not local police. We don't know who might be compromised. Jennifer nodded solemnly. Be careful, Franco. As a final precaution, Frank called Jessica at her sister's house. The call went to voicemail. He left a brief message, careful not to reveal specific plans. Things are coming together, he said. I think this will all be resolved soon. When it's over, maybe we could take that trip to the coast you mentioned. He paused, then added quietly, Take care of yourself, Jess. The abandoned warehouse loomed dark against the night sky as Frank approached at 11:55 p.m. The industrial district was deserted at this hour, the only sounds coming from distant freight trains and the occasional passing car on the highway beyond. Frank entered through a side door as instructed, flashlight illuminating the dusty interior. The vast space was filled with rusting machinery and stacked pallets, creating a labyrinth of shadows. Near the center of the warehouse, Frank discovered a makeshift table with photographs spread across its surface. They were images of the Riverside fire that had never been released to the public, shots showing the sprinkler system pipes with clear signs of tampering. This was the evidence they needed, confirming their suspicions. As Frank examined the photos, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found himself facing Marcus Geller and a man he recognized as the former inspector, Reynolds. Behind them stood a burly security guard who closed and locked the door they'd entered through. You know what the problem is with retired firefighters like you, Wilson? Geller smiled coldly as the guard moved closer. You never learn when a case is already cold and buried, just like you'll be if you keep digging where you shouldn't. The warehouse air hung thick with dust motes, dancing in the beam of Frank's flashlight. Geller's smug smile made Frank's blood boil, but he maintained a calm exterior, quickly assessing the situation. 3 men, one armed, and a locked door behind them. The odds weren't in his favor. Interesting reading material you've left out, Frank replied, gesturing to the photos of the tampered sprinkler system. Seems like someone wanted these to be found. Geller's smile faltered momentarily. A necessary piece of theater. We needed to confirm if you were working alone or reporting to someone. He glanced toward the windows. And based on your pitiful attempt at surveillance, I'm guessing Chief Kelly is parked about a block away, thinking he's being clever. Reynolds, the former inspector, shifted nervously. Let's get this over with, Marcus. I told you we should have left town when the investigation reopened. And abandon everything we've built? Geller scoffed. This minor inconvenience will be resolved tonight. Frank kept his expression neutral, mentally calculating distances and potential weapons within reach. A length of pipe lay on a nearby workbench. The exposed electrical panel behind Geller Might provide a distraction if necessary. "You've been busy for years, haven't you?" Frank said, stalling for time. "Setting fires, collecting insurance must be quite profitable." "Business opportunities for those smart enough to see them," Geller replied with a shrug. "The Riverside was my most lucrative project. A failing hotel transformed into prime redevelopment real estate with a generous insurance payment to fund the transition." "And 3 people died?" Frank said, his voice hardening. Geller's face showed no remorse. "An unfortunate complication. One that wouldn't have happened if your friend Officer Miller and his colleagues hadn't decided to conduct their surprise inspection." Frank's hands clenched involuntarily. "So you accelerated your timeline." "We had no choice," Reynolds interjected, his voice betraying his discomfort. "They found irregularities in the wiring that would have triggered a more thorough inspection. The whole operation would have been exposed." "So you decided murder was preferable to prison," Frank stated flatly. Geller shook his head. "We decided business continuity was essential. The sprinkler system was already prepared for our planned event the following month. We simply moved up the schedule. The deaths were collateral damage." The cold calculation in Geller's voice confirmed everything Frank had suspected. These men had orchestrated multiple arsons over the years, perfecting their system until the Riverside forced them to improvise, with deadly consequences. "And now you're planning to add more collateral damage?" Frank asked, looking pointedly at the security guard who was slowly moving to flank him. "Nothing so dramatic," Geller assured him. "A simple accident. Former firefighter, overcome with guilt and remorse over past failures, returns to the scene of his greatest tragedy and takes his own life. Poetic, really." Frank noticed the guard removing something from his pocket, a small device with a distinctive red button, an incendiary trigger. "The police already know I'm here," Frank said, taking a step backward. "They know you received an anonymous tip," Geller corrected. "They don't know what you found. By morning, all this evidence will be ash, along with you. A tragic end to your heroic comeback story." Reynolds pulled out a zippered case, removing a syringe. "This will make things easier. You'll be unconscious when the fire starts." Frank's mind raced, searching for options. Sam and Detective Rivera were waiting nearby, but they'd agreed to give Frank 20 minutes before checking in. He still had at least 10 minutes before they'd become concerned. "The building's sprinkler system won't cooperate with your plan," Frank bluffed. "I checked it on the way in. Fully functional." Reynolds laughed nervously. "Nice try. This building hasn't had a working sprinkler system in years. That's partly why we chose it." Frank had suspected as much, noting the deteriorated state of the visible pipes. He scanned the warehouse again, locating a fire extinguisher mounted on a column about 15 feet away, if he could reach it. "I have to admit, your operation was impressive," Frank said, taking another small step backward. "You've managed to stay under the radar for years. How many buildings altogether?" Geller smiled, pride overcoming caution. 11 successful projects over 12 years. The insurance companies never connected the dots. "Until now," Frank pointed out. "The FBI is already building a case." "With what evidence?" Geller scoffed. "Circumstantial connections and coincidences. Nothing concrete." Frank gestured to the photos on the table. "Until these, pretty damning proof of tampering." "Which is why they'll never leave this building," Geller replied. He nodded to the guard. "Prepare the device. We need to be gone in 10 minutes." The security guard moved toward a stack of pallets, placing what Frank now recognized as a time-delayed incendiary device among the dry wood. The warehouse would become an inferno within minutes of activation. Frank knew his window of opportunity was closing. "I assume Commissioner Brandt is involved too. Must be expensive, keeping city officials in your pocket." The question struck a nerve. Reynolds glanced sharply at Geller, who frowned. "You've been thorough," Geller admitted, "but it won't help you." As the security guard returned, syringe in hand, Frank made his move. He lunged for the workbench, grabbing the length of pipe and swinging it in a wide arc. The guard ducked, but the distraction gave Frank enough time to knock over the table, sending the photographic evidence scattering across the floor. "Stop him!" Geller shouted, as Frank dove behind a stack of crates. The guard pursued, but Frank had the advantage of decades of experience navigating through smoke-filled environments. He wove through the warehouse's obstacles, making his way toward the fire extinguisher he'd spotted earlier. A shot rang out, splintering wood inches from Frank's head. The stakes had just gotten higher. "You're only making this worse for yourself, Wilson," Geller called out. "There's no way out." Frank reached the fire extinguisher, wrenching it from its bracket, just as the guard rounded the corner. Without hesitation, Frank discharged the extinguisher directly into the man's face, temporarily blinding him. The guard's weapon clattered to the ground as he clutched at his eyes. Frank seized the momentary advantage, using the heavy extinguisher as a battering ram to knock the security guard unconscious. 1 down, 2 to go. But his victory was short-lived. As Frank turned, Reynolds appeared at the end of the aisle, blocking his path. "Don't make me hurt you," Frank warned, though his shoulder ached from the exertion, a reminder of his age and limitations. Reynolds held up the syringe. "Just surrender, Wilson. Make it easier on yourself." Frank responded by hurling the empty extinguisher at Reynolds, forcing him to dive aside. Frank charged past, heading back toward the center of the warehouse where the photographic evidence lay scattered. As he rounded the corner, he saw Geller frantically gathering the photos. More concerning was the small red light, now blinking on the incendiary device. It had been activated. "It's too late," Geller said, standing with the photos clutched to his chest. "This place will be engulfed in less than 5 minutes." Frank assessed the situation quickly. The incendiary device was positioned to ignite the pallets, which would spread to the rest of the warehouse in minutes. The dry, dusty environment would feed the flames, creating an inferno that would destroy all evidence and anyone inside. "Give me the photos, Geller," Frank demanded, "or we both burn." "I'll take my chances," Geller replied, backing toward the exit. "Reynolds, time to go." Frank heard sirens in the distance. Sam must have decided to check in early. Relief flooded through him, quickly replaced by determination. He couldn't let Geller escape with the evidence. As Frank moved toward Geller, a tremendous crash sounded from overhead. A section of the deteriorated roof gave way, sending debris crashing down between them. Geller stumbled backward, losing his grip on the photos as he fell. The old wooden ceiling beams, rotten with age and water damage, continued to collapse, creating a chain reaction throughout the warehouse. Frank dove for cover as dust and debris filled the air. When he looked up, he saw that Geller was trapped beneath a fallen beam, the photos scattered around him. The first tendrils of flame were already licking at the pallets near the incendiary device. Frank had seconds to decide. Gather the evidence or try to save Geller. The Riverside Hotel flashed through his mind, the guilt he'd carried for years over the lives he couldn't save. Geller deserved justice, not death, and Frank wasn't going to let another person die on his watch, even if that person was responsible for 3 deaths. "Hold on," Frank called, making his way carefully through the falling debris toward Geller. Outside, the sirens grew louder. Frank could hear Sam shouting his name as multiple vehicles arrived on scene. The beam that pinned Geller was heavy, but not impossible to move. Frank positioned himself, ignoring the pain in his shoulder as he leveraged his weight against the fallen timber. "Why are you helping me?" Geller gasped, his face pale with pain and fear. "Because that's what I do," Frank grunted, shifting the beam enough for Geller to drag himself free. The flames were spreading rapidly now, fed by the dry wood and accelerant from the device. Smoke filled the warehouse, thick and acrid. Frank quickly gathered the scattered photographs, stuffing them into his jacket. "Can you walk?" he asked Geller, who nodded weakly, clutching his injured leg. Frank helped him up, supporting his weight as they navigated toward the exit. The heat intensified behind them, the roar of the fire growing louder with each passing second. They were 20 feet from the door when another section of roof collapsed, blocking their path with flaming debris. Frank looked around desperately, his firefighter's instincts evaluating escape routes. There, he pointed to a side window, large enough for them to climb through. As they changed direction, Frank heard splintering wood and shouting outside. Someone was breaking through the main door, Sam and the rescue team. "Franco, where are you?" Sam's voice carried through the smoke. "East side," Frank shouted back, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Window exit." Together, Frank and Geller reached the window. The glass had already shattered from the heat, but the frame was partially blocked by fallen shelving. Frank cleared the path, ignoring the cuts on his hands as he worked. "Go through," he instructed Geller, helping the injured man navigate the opening. Outside, firefighters in full gear appeared, pulling Geller to safety. Hands reached back in for Frank, who was now struggling to breathe in the intensifying smoke. "Come on, old-timer," a young firefighter urged, extending his arm through the window. Frank handed over the precious photos first, ensuring the evidence was secure before reaching for the offered hand. As he did, a final section of ceiling gave way directly overhead. Frank lunged forward, the young firefighter's strong grip closing around his wrist, just as debris crashed down where he had stood seconds before. With a mighty pull, the firefighter dragged Frank through the window and away from the building. Frank collapsed onto the ground, gasping for fresh air as paramedics rushed forward. Through watering eyes, he saw Geller being handcuffed to a stretcher, Reynolds already in custody in the back of a police car. "Cutting it close, Franco," Sam said, kneeling beside him as paramedics fitted an oxygen mask over Frank's face. Frank removed the mask momentarily. "The photos, safe," Sam assured him. "And so are you, thank God." As Frank was loaded into an ambulance, he glimpsed the warehouse now fully engulfed in flames. The firefighters had established a perimeter, focusing on containment rather than saving the abandoned structure. While flames illuminated the night sky, Frank thought about the impossible choice he had faced inside that burning building, advancing his quest for justice or saving the life of the very man responsible for his years of guilt. In choosing to rescue Geller, Frank had finally put to rest the ghosts of the Riverside Hotel, proving to himself that facing the flames wasn't just about courage, but about humanity, even when that humanity was extended to those who might least deserve it. The blaze from the warehouse painted the night sky in angry shades of orange and red as Frank watched from the back of the ambulance. Paramedics had cleaned and bandaged his hands, but he refused further treatment until he was certain that the evidence had been properly secured. "The photos?" Frank asked again as Sam approached, his fire chief's uniform dusted with soot. Sam held up an evidence bag. "All accounted for. The FBI agents are already processing them." He looked at Frank with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "You realize you had no business pulling Geller out of there, right? After everything he did?" Frank adjusted the oxygen mask on his face, taking a deep breath before responding. In that moment, he wasn't a criminal. He was just another person about to die in a fire. He paused, the memories of Riverside washing over him. "I couldn't live with another death on my conscience, even his." The decision had been instantaneous, made in the fraction of a second, when Frank saw Geller trapped beneath the fallen beam. Years of training had overtaken any desire for vengeance. In that moment, Frank had been nothing more or less than what he'd always been: a firefighter, someone who saved lives regardless of who was in danger. "Geller's being transported to Memorial under police guard," Sam informed him. "Reynolds is already at the station, singing like a canary. Apparently the prospect of a manslaughter charge has loosened his tongue." Frank nodded, watching as firefighters continued to battle the warehouse blaze. The structure was a total loss, but they had contained it from spreading to neighboring buildings. Among the crew, he recognized young Lieutenant Michaels, directing operations with a competence that reminded Frank of himself 30 years earlier. "The kid's good," he commented. "Learn from the best," Sam replied, following Frank's gaze. They all did. A police cruiser pulled up, and Detective Rivera emerged, approaching the ambulance with purpose. "Wilson, you have more lives than a cat," she said, shaking her head. "The FBI wants your statement, but I convinced them it could wait until morning." "I appreciate that," Frank replied. "Don't thank me yet," Rivera cautioned. "This case just got a lot bigger. Reynolds has implicated Commissioner Brandt and 2 other city officials in the scheme. There's going to be fallout." Frank wasn't surprised. The corruption necessary to sustain Geller's operation over the years had to have reached into the highest levels of city government. Brandt's involvement explained how the original Riverside investigation had been redirected away from any suggestion of foul play. "Any word on whether they've picked up Brandt?" Frank asked. Rivera nodded. "State police are executing search warrants as we speak. They're moving quickly to prevent evidence from disappearing." Hours later, Frank sat in a hospital room, stubbornly refusing the doctor's recommendation that he stay overnight for observation. His lungs ached from smoke inhalation, and his shoulder throbbed where he'd strained at moving the beam. But these were familiar discomforts, almost welcome in their reminder of a job well done. The door opened and Frank looked up expectantly, hoping it might be Jessica. Instead, Jennifer entered, followed by Sam and, to Frank's surprise, Emma's parents. "You're supposed to be at the lake house," Frank said to Robert and Diane Thompson. "We drove back when we heard," Robert replied. "Emma wouldn't stop asking about you until we promised to check in." Diane held out her phone, showing a text message with a dozen anxious questions from Emma about Mr. Frank and whether he was really okay. "Tell her I'm fine," Frank said, touched by the girl's concern. "Just a little smoky." Jennifer placed a newspaper on his bed tray. The special morning edition headline read, "Hero Firefighter Exposes Arson Conspiracy," accompanied by a photo of Frank being helped from the warehouse. "You're famous again," she teased. "They're calling you the Phoenix, rising from retirement to save the day twice." Frank groaned. "That's terrible." "Emma will love it," Robert laughed. "She's already told her entire class that her personal superhero was fighting crime last night." The mood sobered when Sam updated them on the latest developments. Reynolds had provided a complete statement, detailing over a dozen properties targeted in the arson scheme over 12 years. The conspiracy had begun as simple insurance fraud, but escalated when the profits proved too tempting to abandon. "The Riverside was supposed to be their crowning achievement," Sam explained. "A failing hotel with massive insurance coverage. But when Miller and his team conducted their surprise inspection, they found evidence of preparations for the fire. Geller panicked and moved up the timeline before everything was properly prepared. That's why the casualties were so high," Frank said, the pieces finally fitting together. "The evacuation routes were compromised sooner than they expected." Jennifer nodded grimly. Reynolds admitted that in all previous jobs, they'd ensured the buildings were nearly empty before starting the fires. The Riverside was different. They rushed and made mistakes. For the first time in 3 years, Frank felt the weight of guilt lifting from his shoulders. The deaths at Riverside hadn't been due to his failures as a firefighter, but were the result of calculated criminal actions. The knowledge didn't bring back the people who died, but it released Frank from the private prison of blame he'd constructed for himself. The following day, a formal ceremony was hastily arranged at the fire department headquarters. Frank stood uncomfortably in his dress uniform, recovered from the back of his closet and hurriedly pressed as the mayor publicly acknowledged the department's findings and officially exonerated Frank from any responsibility for the Riverside tragedy. The city of Lakeview offers its profound apologies to retired Captain Frank Wilson, the mayor announced to the assembled crowd of firefighters, police officers, and media. His dedication and professionalism were never in doubt by those who knew him best. and today we recognize that his actions during the Riverside Hotel fire saved countless lives under circumstances deliberately sabotaged by criminal elements. Frank accepted the formal letter of exoneration with mixed emotions. Being publicly vindicated mattered less to him than the private knowledge that he had done everything possible that night. Still, he couldn't deny the relief of having his professional reputation restored. As the ceremony concluded, Frank spotted Jessica at the back of the room, having just arrived from her sister's home. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and the connection between them felt tangible, even at a distance. Later that afternoon, Frank visited the memorial wall where the names of fallen firefighters and police officers were inscribed, including David Miller. Jessica joined him, slipping her hand into his as they stood in silent contemplation. "David would be proud," she said finally. "Not just of solving the case, but of how you did it, choosing to save Geller despite everything he'd done." Frank nodded, tracing David's name with his fingertips. "I made a different choice this time. At Riverside, I followed protocol, evacuated in sequence, did everything by the book. This time, I followed my instincts." "And it made all the difference," Jessica replied. 3 months later, Frank walked through Lakeview Park, the summer sun warming his face. The lake where everything had begun now sparkled with sunlight, children paddling in safe areas under the watchful eyes of parents. Among them was Emma, enthusiastically demonstrating proper water safety techniques to younger children, while Max bounded along the shoreline, apparently appointed the unofficial safety mascot. Jessica walked beside Frank, their fingers intertwined comfortably. The past 3 months had seen dramatic changes in both their lives. The full extent of the arson conspiracy had been exposed, resulting in multiple arrests and ongoing federal investigations. Geller and his accomplices had accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against higher-level officials, ensuring that justice would extend to everyone involved. Frank had fully embraced his role as community safety director, expanding the program to include specialized training for school staff and community leaders. The junior firefighter program had tripled in size, with Emma proudly serving as its youngest member. "I never expected this," Frank admitted as they approached the bench where he had once sat alone contemplating the frozen lake. "Any of it," Jessica squeezed his hand. "What part? Solving a major conspiracy? Becoming a community hero, or us?" "All of it," Frank replied with a small smile. "Especially us." To his surprise, the bench now bore a small brass plaque that hadn't been there the previous week. "Heroes Bench," in honor of Frank Wilson, who taught us it's never too late to save a life, including your own. "This is embarrassing," Frank muttered, though his eyes crinkled with suppressed pleasure. "Get used to it," Jessica teased. "The mayor wants you to speak at the opening of the new training center next month." Frank watched Emma demonstrating to a group of children how to properly fit a life jacket, her confidence and enthusiasm infectious. Max sat attentively at her side, occasionally barking his apparent approval of her instructions. "You know," Frank said thoughtfully, "for a man who thought his rescue days were over, I've been doing quite a bit of it lately." Jessica leaned against his shoulder. "Some people are born for it." "For rescuing others?" Frank asked. "No," Jessica smiled, kissing his cheek gently. "For allowing themselves to be rescued too."